Today is the 30th of June, 2015, and the title is Ronald Reagan Runs in the Republican Primary Against Vice President Ford in 1976, and Part 2, in the next election, Ronald Reagan beats the incumbent Jimmy Carter in November of 1980. My guest is Dave DeWitt, co-editor and reporter for the Athens News, and I am Robert Whaley, retired historian from Ohio University. And this is Athens Speakout, number 336. In 1966, Ronald Reagan was elected as governor of California, and he was reelected in a second term in 1970 as governor. And in 1966, Ronald Reagan was well known by the TV and movie fans, but historians and political scientists and governors, and senators and Republicans and Democrats outside of California really were not paying too much attention to this Hollywood actor. Ronald Reagan was a supporter of Richard Nixon as far back as 1952, when Nixon became the vice president under Dwight Eisenhower, and all during Nixon's rise and fall up to his impeachment in 1974. During the long Vietnam years from 1946 to 75, and we must remember that the Indo-Chinese War was in two phases, the French phase and the American phase, and Americans never really paid much attention to it until 1964, when Lyndon Johnson escalated. But Ronald Reagan paid very little attention to the Vietnam War. He was devoted to domestic anti-communist speeches. Now, Jimmy Carter had good intentions in 1976 in trying to advocate détente with the Soviet Union, détente with the People's Republic of China, and he even took on the difficult task of mediating between the Palestinians, who were Muslims, and the Jewish state of Israel. And he seemed to be succeeding up until 1979, but in 1979, his campaigns unraveled in a year's time. Henry Kissinger, scholar at Harvard, Hans J. Morgenthau, historian at University of Chicago, and A.J.P. Taylor, diplomatic historian at Oxford, were my three mentors as I began to study history, and I always focused on the problems of war and peace, and I had some knowledge of all the presidents since Franklin Roosevelt, although I first voted in 1960 for John Kennedy at age 30. Well, the United States had great ambitions to fill the shoes of the British Empire and the French Empire and the Italian Empire and the Japanese Empire and the German Empire. All of these European empires destroyed themselves in two world wars, and that leads to a problem for the American people. What is the difference between imperialism and democracy? And the United States kind of stumbled into these long wars, and the problem of imperialism was never faced by Truman, by Eisenhower, and by none of the presidents up until Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter began to have his fingers burned on that unresolved problem. Johnson and Nixon were two big failures, by bogging down in the unwinnable wars of Indochina, jungles and swamps. And they were closet imperialists. They didn't admit it. But that's what later historians see, that they were trying to establish some kind of a air base on somebody else's territory in Indochina. And the cost of that to lives and money was far too great. And Henry Kissinger got Richard Nixon to gradually pull out of that quagmire. So my first question, that's all been reviewed.
Yes.
What was Ronald Reagan's reputation when he won those 2 terms as governor in 1966 and 1970?
In California?
Yeah.
Well, he ran on a promise to crack down on the welfare bums.
Yeah.
And put people back to work and turn around the California economy.
Right.
In one sense, he did turn around the California economy, but it was pretty bad to begin with when he got in there.
How did he turn it around?
Well, it was deeply in debt, and
did he ever get out of debt?
Well, I don't think he got entirely out of debt, but he got in less debt.
Well, I don't have the figures on that.
I don't want to begrudge him that.
No, I don't have the figures on that. But as an observer from Ohio, I didn't follow the statistics.
Yeah. And of course, I only know from what I've read.
Yeah. Well, what did Ronald Reagan learn from the race between Nelson Rockefeller of New York and Barry Goldwater of Arizona in 1964?
Well, I think he learned where the power structures lied within the Republican Party nationally.
Right.
You had Goldwater, a libertarian
Right.
in the American sense of the word.
Right.
And you had Rockefeller, moderate Republican, big business Republican, but moderate by any standard. By today's standards, I'm not even sure he would be a Republican, how far the Republican Party's gone to the right.
All right.
But Reagan learned, obviously, where the power lines were drawn, where the money was raised.
Right.
How to raise money, how to build a national profile.
Right. So, okay, another question then. What are the skills necessary to get elected, and why are there different skills in the problem of a campaign, and how does that differ from the problem of governing once you're in office?
Well, I touched on a little bit of the first part of that question,
Right.
raising money.
Yeah.
Building up a constituency,
Right.
and making a lot of promises.
Right.
And that's what leads to the problem with the second part of the question. Once you're governing, you face political reality, and you've made a lot of promises to a lot of people who've given you a lot of money.
Right.
And you have to square the promises that you made, serving your constituents,
Right.
and the practical matters of governance.
Right.
Which is not an easy thing to do, and I think that's why some politicians are much better in opposition than they are when they
Right.
actually get into office.
Well, what was Ronald Reagan's unique skills that no other president ever had?
Well, he was
Probably never have again either.
he was a professional actor.
Right. And
He
how
was.
did that help him get elected?
I think we mentioned this last time,
Right.
perhaps.
Right.
I think one of his lines that I enjoyed was somebody asked him how an actor could be president, and he replied, "I don't see how you can be president without being an actor."
Yeah, well, that's just technique. What was his
Yeah.
line? Well, he had a constant line. He never gave it up.
The Morning in America? Are you talking about
No,
1980?
I'm talking about communism. What do you have to say about communism?
Oh, well, he was a virulent anti-communist. He
Right.
played up the anti-communism hysteria.
Right.
He tapped into that as soon as when he was working for, was GE, I believe.
right.
And even when he was the head of the Screen Actors Union,
Right.
he was an FBI informant.
Right.
He bought
Right.
wholesale into the communism threat,
Right.
and learned to exploit it politically when he entered
Well,
politics.
he didn't have to work very hard because the mass media, ever since Truman came to office, was constantly denouncing communism as the center of all evil. So all
Truman
he had to
needed
do
an
is
excuse to
just,
keep a standing army.
Yeah, just keep repeating it. You know, I'm going to be the anti-communist, and Jimmy Carter obviously failed. He didn't handle China right. He didn't handle Soviet Union right.
Right, he wouldn't stand up or whatever.
So what
it
did
might
he do
be.
about Soviet Union and China once he got in office?
What did Reagan do?
Yeah.
After 1980? Well, he had, which one, Soviet Union or China?
Or
all of them?
Or Iraq. What did he do about? See, Carter had so-called baggage,
Mm-hmm.
and Reagan exploited Carter's difficulties. But did he resolve any of them?
I wouldn't say so. I think that he gets way too much credit for the downfall of the Soviet Union in the late 80s.
Right. The Soviet Union collapsed from implosion from within.
Yeah. Oh, yes. And I think that throughout all those decades,
Right.
and maybe you could tell me better than,
Right.
but my impression is that the Soviet Union was lifted up as being much more powerful
That's right.
and threatening than it ever really was. I think it
right.
was a much more weak and reactive state,
Right.
whereas we were much more powerful and
Right.
proactive, I suppose.
Yeah.
I think that there was the Red Menace was built up.
Absolutely.
And I don't think that the American public probably had a very accurate conception of
No, they had a fear.
the true strength of the Soviet
had a
Union, which
fear.
wasn't nearly as high as
Yeah,
they were
that's
being sold.
That's right. And Truman and Eisenhower and Johnson and Nixon all sold the same line.
Oh, yeah.
So
Well, they were
Reagan-
keeping a standing army for the first time in American history.
That's
Do
true.
you think that was part of it? The threat
Well,
of communism was the excuse for the military-industrial complex?
Well, it doesn't work quite so rationally as that. What happens is that fear leads to the congressmen. This is where the fear is. Congressmen are afraid of Stalin. So anytime the Defense Department wants money, we need more airplanes. You got the money.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a kind of an indirect fear. In other words, the congressmen are afraid of communism in the abstract, and they'll vote funds as long as it's qualified to be for defense. They never ask the question, what are you defending against?
Right.
Stalin had no plan to invade France, but yet that was the constant fear.
Right.
Now, Stalin did intervene in peripheral countries. He did send airplanes to Korea.
Sure.
He did send missiles to Ho Chi Minh.
Mm-hmm.
But this is rather cheap compared to the ultimate cost of the Vietnam War. It was the peasants of North Vietnam that sacrificed their lives to win that war.
Yeah.
And the Soviets were glad to give a few missiles to keep it going,
Yeah.
as long as Ho Chi Minh was willing to fight.
And that was the big sell to the American people.
right.
We're in Vietnam to stop the spread of communism
Yeah.
throughout the world.
But they never said how.
Right. And they didn't say what would be accomplished.
Right.
And I think that it fundamentally misunderstood what the Vietnamese were fighting over, because I don't think that they were fighting for communism as much as they were fighting out of a sense of nationalism and
They
national
wanted to
pride.
unify the country of first Indochina.
Right.
And then when that became impractical, they said, we'll be satisfied with just unifying Vietnam.
Right.
So
Yes.
why did Johnson and Nixon spend so much money in trying to maintain this artificial 38th parallel against the natural gravity of the Vietnamese nationals to unify? It was Ho Chi Minh's country.
I honestly have no idea. I would love to hear Johnson's rationalization for that.
Well,
I mean, we hear a lot about the fog of war and
well,
mission creep.
Johnson, after it was all over, they said, well, why did you fight so long? Johnson said, well, I didn't want to wake up the next Monday morning and read in the Washington Post that Johnson just lost Vietnam.
Yeah.
It was a negative.
Oh, sure. And he still had Richard Nixon out there.
He still had
being
the fear.
Richard Nixon.
He had the fear of the Republicans.
And Richard Nixon was going to be ready to whip up that fervor.
That's right.
At any chance he got, because he was still eyeing 1968.
Yeah. And then, of course, Nixon used the line that the Democrats had sold out China. Well, they didn't sell out China. It wasn't the United States' possession to sell.
Right.
But people will buy a cliche.
Sure, yeah.
Now, what did happen was that Mao Zedong, on his own, won a civil war against Chiang Kai-shek, who was a corrupt landlord financed by the United States. And gradually, the Chinese people had more faith in a native Chinese, Mao, and the Soviets kept their aid to Mao almost quasi-secret. It was Mao's war to win.
Right.
But the United States Congress were always saying, we can bolster Chiang Kai-shek, we'll give you the aid. So the American public opinion was ignorant of China, ignorant of Indochina, and ignorant of the Russian Revolution of Lenin and Stalin. Why did they even go into revolution?
The Bolshevik, well, that could be a whole episode.
Just totally ignorant of what makes a revolutionary.
Right.
And so it was a fear. But anyway, Ronald Reagan built on the fear of 20 or 30 years of built-in anti-communism. And it was a relatively easy election to win on those slogans. And the voters were still living in the dark about the nature of imperialism and why people in third world countries have a tendency to revolt against imperial powers. Okay. Most presidents are lawyers or governors or generals. And Woodrow Wilson was, like Reagan, unique. He was the only president who started out as a historian and political scientist, and then he became president of Princeton University. And Harry Truman was somewhat unique as being a ward healer in the Kansas City political machine. I don't think any other machine boss ever became president. Usually the machine bosses...
Can't think of one. I can think of a couple candidates, but not
yeah, they didn't get very
winners.
far. In other words, Mayor Daley always supported somebody else for president.
Sure.
Like John Kennedy. Well, anyway, now, Harry Truman was not totally unique. The 8th president of the United States, Martin Van Buren, had the first state machine. He elected Andrew Jackson with the New York State machine, and that was because New York State was the most urbanized and the easiest to organize. So that was never really explained how Andrew Jackson was able to win as president with so little background in the northern regions. Anyway, New York State was the first of the machine elections, and Kansas City was getting into that same urban lifestyle when Truman accidentally became senator and accidentally became president. But he didn't plan it. He had the presidency thrust upon him. Ronald Reagan planned it. That's the difference. One of the differences.
Oh, yeah. He had been seeking it for 16 years.
Yep, right. So Carter then also was lacking in history and did not know the complexities of two Muslim states and oil imperialism and the CIA, and he did not understand the Zionist and how different the Zionists are from the Jews of his biblical studies as a young man. So, okay, a new question. How did Ronald Reagan do in the Republican primary of 1976?
In 1976, Ronald Reagan challenged the sitting president, fellow Republican Gerald Ford. He did surprisingly well, I think.
Right. That's right.
He won 23 states compared to 27 for Ford.
That's right.
He took 4.76 million votes.
Right. You got those
to
statistics
5.5.
Right.
Round up to 5.53.
You got it right on the head.
For Ford.
Right.
Ford had 53% of the vote.
Right.
Reagan had 46%.
Right.
It was really close, considering that Ford was an incumbent president.
Right. Do you know anything about the states that Ford won and Reagan won?
I saw the map, but I can't say that I paid much attention
Well,
to which
Ford
ones.
took the northeast corner of the United States, the more liberal states, and Minnesota, and Reagan took California and the western southern states from Texas to Virginia. So there's a regional basis between Ford and... See, Ford came from Michigan.
Right.
So as I say...
that stayed up north. He
yeah,
even played for their football team,
There is the
Ohio
old
State
north-south
fans.
split
Yeah.
that still works, okay? And that then gave an indication of Ford's... In other words, the liberal Republicans that were still liberal Republicans voted for Ford, not Reagan.
Right.
And Reagan took the most anti-communist groups.
He took the Birchers.
Yeah, and Texas and Virginia and California, right? The most uninformed, okay? So without television, there may not have been a Ronald Reagan. And television was his great strength. And television was the thing that sabotaged McGovern's campaign for for peace. So, the voter will always vote being uninformed for the man who's best advertised, rather than for peace, which is hard to acquire. That's a hard task. So, in 1964, the election was a big defeat for Goldwater, and what did Reagan learn from that? What did he learn?
When Goldwater lost in 1964?
Why did Goldwater lose and only take 5 states?
Why did Goldwater lose? Well, I think that Lyndon Johnson was riding high in some ways off of the civil rights movement, although there was still...
No, but I mean within the Republican primary.
Oh, the primary.
Yeah,
Why did Goldwater win in 64?
What did Goldwater learn from that? I mean, what did Reagan learn from the Goldwater campaign?
I think that...
He was really sitting on the sidelines in 64.
Yeah. Well, I think that he saw the advantage.
He didn't have any stake in Nelson Rockefeller or Goldwater.
Right. Well, and then Rockefeller ended up imploding himself anyway with his divorce and that stuff.
Right.
But I think that, if you look at the way that he ran subsequently, as a conservative, anti-communist, he didn't try to be the moderate that Rockefeller did. He tacked more toward Goldwater. So I would say that he learned to appeal to the conservative side of the Republican Party more.
Well, I think that Ronald Reagan learned that politics is not football, and it's not even beanbag. He saw the money. This is where he learns the money. He raised money for Goldwater, and he became well-known speaker in the party. And they say, hey, this man can be run for governor of California. So he learned from the inside administration, inside the convention, of where the money was.
Right.
He knew that Goldwater would lose. He knew that Ronald Reagan, that Rockefeller would lose. They would both lose. But Ronald Reagan then was able to kind of pick up tips from both sides, in a sense.
You saw how the game was played.
Yeah, he plays how he's getting into practical politics.
Yeah.
He went from movie acting into who's who.
Yeah.
Who's who in the Republican Party.
Where the power structures lie.
Yeah, that's what
How
he
to exploit
learned
them.
from that. So getting back to the primary system then, let's talk about some of these states' popular spirit. And let's talk about the next election. How does the primary system work? Why does the primary begin in Iowa and New Hampshire? And what was his strategy for Iowa and New Hampshire?
Well,
He knew he had to go through that system.
yeah.
That was already established.
I'm not sure why that system is in place except for tradition. I mean,
Well, there's a big difference.
but there's a huge difference between the primary election in New
That's
Hampshire
right.
and the Iowa caucuses.
Right.
The Iowa caucuses give a tremendous opportunity for lesser well-known
That's right.
candidates or even
Right.
lesser financed candidates to make a big push and make a big showing, take advantage of the caucus process, which works where you have groups
Okay.
in gymnasiums
Right.
gathering to different sides to support different candidates.
Well, if you go back to the beginning of the country, the elections began with all caucus states. And the primary was introduced about 1900. And there were only 12 states that had a primary. Wisconsin, New Hampshire, and so Iowa is an old traditional state where the farmers talk to their neighbors and the farmers have a direct contact with the candidate.
Right.
Okay. So that's the theory of the caucus. Now, this helps the beginner.
Right.
Dukakis gained because Dukakis as a Greek was totally unknown when he ran in 1988. But through hard work, he went to 99 counties and he came in second in the Iowa caucus. Total surprise.
Yeah, but that can be,
But he
that's
worked for-
enough.
he
That's
worked
enough
for
to
it.
launch
He worked for it.
someone.
Yeah, right. Now, New Hampshire helps Massachusetts.
Right.
Because if you win New Hampshire, there's a pullover, okay? So New Hampshire has traditionally had the first primary in February in the winter, and the Iowa caucus is in January. So not many candidates want to start out in there. So Ronald Reagan says, well, I'm well known. I'm not going to bother with Iowa. He didn't bother to go.
Yeah.
But he does go to New Hampshire. What does he do in New Hampshire in 1980? In the Republican,
Well, he takes it.
In the Republican Party. Yeah, but how?
What's his strategy?
Yeah, what's
well,
his strategy?
There's the three different areas of New Hampshire, right, that they focus on?
Well, no, it's got nothing to do with that.
Okay.
Ronald
I'm not sure where
Reagan
you're going to go.
used his speaking talents, and he set up a speaking engagement in Nashua, New Hampshire. And he said, I'll debate George Bush if you come to Nashua. And this was outside the regular New Hampshire party procedure.
Oh, I see.
So Ronald Reagan makes a kind of a militant speech appealing to the war veterans, appealing to the hillbillies, the guys with guns, okay? And he goes to New Hampshire, and they have a debate about who's going to go first.
Oh, I see.
He says, I paid for this microphone, and I'm going to speak first.
That's right. Yes. Oh, I remember this story.
He intimidated him.
The station.
Well,
break.
we have to kind of have a little break here.
Yeah.
We've been talking about how Ronald Reagan rises from obscurity to fame. We're now up to the 1980 primary in the Republican Party, and Ronald Reagan doesn't campaign in many states and depends on television to carry him through.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is Dave DeWitt. He is a journalist, and we are discussing the rise of Ronald Reagan. And this is Athens Speakout. And you can give your point of view here now on this 1980 campaign.
It's funny. I just read about this recently.
Right.
I forget where I read about it, but I did just read about this recently. So he was determined to have a debate. He invites George H.W. Bush to have a debate in New Hampshire.
Right.
He says, I'll pay for the whole thing.
Right.
And he does pay for the whole thing to set this thing up. And then during they're trying to figure out who's going to speak, and then he comes out and he gets on the microphone and starts talking to the audience. Now, one of the moderators, I think from one of the newspapers there, objects to this and says, no, you can't do that. That's unfair. That's unfair to all the candidates to have Ronald Reagan out there speaking. And Reagan has his famous line that you just referenced before the station break. I paid for this debate, and I paid for this microphone, and I'm going to speak.
Right.
And it just showed, I think, well, he obviously displays his knack for performance.
Right. Now, another odd thing about this Republican primary in August of 1980, before we even get to New Hampshire, was it was held in Detroit. That's an odd place for a Republican convention.
Yeah.
Do you know why?
Well, Detroit, I mean, is a big union.
Yeah, but that's odd for Republicans.
Oh, yeah, that's what I mean. For Republicans, Detroit is a big Democratic union center, hub.
Yeah. Well, I think it was set up, that date was set up, and the place was set up a year or two before.
Was George Romney Michigan governor at that point?
Yeah, he was, but I don't think Romney had anything to do with the 1980 campaign. That was way back in when Johnson was president.
Oh, okay, in the
George Romney became famous for saying, I was brainwashed.
Yeah.
And they said, well, you're out of the Republican Party. You can't admit that it was American propaganda. We don't have propaganda. We only tell the truth.
Of course.
So he let the cat out of the bag. So anyway, it was a strange place because I think that the Ford Motor Company and the General Motors Company had put up the money to finance this in a brand new Renaissance tower. And what happened in 1967 is the whole town burned down with riots. And this is an attempt on the part of the auto companies to put Detroit back on the map as a Renaissance city. And that this Republican convention would be the first step. Well, that was a hope that didn't pan out. In other words, the Ford Motor Company and the General Motors was assuming that they would restore Detroit to its former days. Mm-hmm. But 1967 was the beginning of the Rust Belt, and it kept on declining.
Right.
And after this convention, Detroit never really did recover. But it was a stab for the automobile.
Kind of a Hail Mary.
Yeah, well, Detroit was number 4 in population back in World War II. Mm-hmm. Okay. And now it's about number 10. It's fallen down, in prestige, population. Now, Detroit is also a funny city ethnically. The UAW, the most radical union in the United States, was run by Walter Reuther, who had read Karl Marx and knew something about class struggle. But the city is divided, one-third black, one-third white hillbilly from Kentucky and Tennessee, and one-third Polish, kind of a ghetto. And it's the union that keeps it together. So it's not a good town for mixing integration, but it was good for wages. And I went there in 1952 to work in the summertime. 1953, when the Korean War was on, and I could go to the University of Michigan fairly cheap. Well, those days are gone forever. So in 1980, it was a city for optimists, and it was held in Detroit. And I don't think it gave Reagan or Governor Bush any advantage or disadvantage. The election was all based on media anyway. And Ronald Reagan won 44 states, and the governor of Texas was kind of a washout with 6 states.
Yeah.
Now there was a third candidate in the race.
John Anderson.
Yeah, dark
from
horse.
Illinois.
And
well, there were a lot of candidates originally,
but they all dropped out rather quickly.
Yeah.
John Anderson
it was a big field.
Actually made the trip to the end.
Right.
What was his campaign speech?
John Anderson's?
Yeah. What was he trying to do?
You'll have to tell us.
Well, John Anderson came from Illinois. He came from rural Illinois, and he was campaigning against the elite in the name of the middle class. And he campaigned against Ronald Reagan as the Hollywood elite and George Bush as the oil elite. That was his great hope. But he didn't do well.
Not a bad strategy, but he's a Republican.
Well, he didn't get any mass media appeal. You know,
Right.
Who's John Anderson?
Right.
Okay. Ronald Reagan won the media, and he took 60% of the 7 million votes cast. And Bush only had 3 million, 29% of the popular vote, and Anderson 12% with 1,600,000. So it was a TV election during the primary, for the Republican primary. And Ronald Reagan traveled to few states and did it all through television, proxy, so to speak. He was no Truman, he was no Kennedy, and he wasn't even a Lyndon Johnson. What Ronald Reagan proved is that he was the best joke teller in political history. And his jokes went over well because most voters don't know much about history. Do you know any Ronald Reagan jokes? Any absurdities?
Oh, I don't remember like a specific. I remember when during the debate with Carter, when he dropped the "There you go again."
Yeah.
That one.
That became a cliche.
Yeah. So, but I don't remember like a specific.
Well,
joke
one of his famous jokes was that they had a TV program and they leave the microphone on, and supposedly it's been turned off. And Reagan says on the microphone, "I just launched the missiles on the Soviet Union." Wow! The bulletin board lit up and so forth and so on.
Yeah.
All kinds of protests. Oh, I was only joking. But he got a lot of publicity from that.
Yeah.
And another one of his absurdities
Joke.
was the major cause of pollution are the leaves from the trees. Well, he was 2 weeks explaining the other way.
Yeah.
He got some officials say, well, I really didn't mean all the leaves. Only certain palm tree leaves.
I hadn't heard that one before.
Well, he didn't get out of that one so easily, because there were a lot of people concerned about pollution. So Ronald Reagan was a great joke teller as far as television was concerned. But I didn't take him seriously at all. What was he going to do when he became president? So anyway, when Ronald Reagan did win, I was more concerned about why Jimmy Carter lost, not why Reagan won. I underestimated the intelligence of the voters. I didn't think they would vote for an actor, but they did. And that was my own naivete. Okay, so what are the results then of the November election in 1980?
With the results of the general election.
I was just talking about the primary.
Yeah, the general election, well, it did not go well for Jimmy Carter.
That's right.
The results were, I have the, let's see here. I have the electoral vote at 489 to 49.
That's right.
Reagan with 489 to 49
right.
for Carter. States carried. Ronald Reagan took 44 states. Jimmy Carter took 6 states plus Washington, D.C.
Right.
The popular vote, I have Reagan at 43.9 million versus 35.5 million, we'll round up, for Carter.
Right.
That's 50.8% for Reagan to 41% for Carter. And our old friend John Anderson is back running as an independent. He got 6.6%.
But took 0 states.
Took 0 states.
That's the problem with third parties.
Yeah.
They can't get on the state's ballots.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
There's been no third party that was a success since the Republican Party of Lincoln.
You're right, like an actual winner? Yeah.
Yeah.
Even Teddy Roosevelt couldn't do it with the bull moose.
That's correct. He lost. He lost. But
Perot made an impact.
But, yeah, well, Teddy Roosevelt made an impact. He got Woodrow Wilson elected.
He did. He did.
Teddy, the Republican Party.
Yeah, Teddy Roosevelt got the Democrat Wilson in. And Perot made an impact, but not, I mean, they can't.
Right. Perot's impact was to defeat George W. Bush.
Right.
On the missing in action issue.
Right.
It was a negative on Bush.
Yeah.
It was a kind of a thing in revenge, really.
And he drew votes away from Bush. Well, yeah, they were both Texas oil guys.
Yeah. Well, no. See, Bush was Texas oil, but Perot made his money in computers. He was a Johnson Democrat because Johnson gave all of the Social Security statistics to his computer company. So he had an independent base.
I see.
He was a former Johnson man who said, okay, I'm going to use my computers to defeat this guy. And he got involved in that from Kissinger, because Kissinger hired his computer company to have statistics on the missing in action. Mm-hmm. And then Kissinger was so anxious to have a peace, a quick peace, he fudged the statistics and say, all right, we're ready for peace now. And Perot knew that there were still some missing in action. So then he put out this little committee after the election of
I see.
And was just thought that Bush and big business was too conspiratorial, and he was the old. See, he came from Arkansas. He came from Texarkana, Arkansas. Mm-hmm. He was right on the border of. He was not in the oil business.
Yeah, I see.
He was a little hillbilly who made good with computers.
Yeah.
So he was independent in that sense.
Yeah. Okay.
And denounced free trade, you know.
Right.
And fought against Al Gore. Okay, and NAFTA. He got NAFTA.
Yeah.
Okay, so anyway, Carter won. Carter lost. Now, what states did Carter win? Let's talk about those 6 states.
Wait, he took. They were kind of sporadic. There was not 2. There were only 2 in the Midwest. I think it would have been Missouri and Montana, maybe.
Well, I think the key is the border states: Maryland, Delaware, and West Virginia.
Okay, yeah.
Those
over
were
in the
3
east,
of the 6.
Yeah.
And then he took Hawaiian Islands. You
Right.
know why?
No, I have no idea.
Hawaiian Islands is the only state in the United States that doesn't have a majority Christian population.
Ah, okay.
It's 49% Japanese and Chinese who have Asian religions.
Yeah.
So they're always far out to the left.
Yeah.
Okay. The Southerners have no say in Hawaiian.
So he took Maryland and
Maryland,
Delaware?
and West Virginia, and the Hawaiian Islands.
He did take West Virginia.
Yep, took West Virginia. Still Southern at that time. And of course, Carter won his own state of Georgia,
Right.
and Mondale won his own state in Minnesota.
Minnesota. Okay, so he did get Minnesota.
So he has Minnesota, Georgia, and
Yeah.
these 3 border states and Hawaii. Those
And
are
that
the 6
was
states.
yeah, that was an interesting election because there was it was part of the transformation, the long transformation of the South.
Right.
And at that time, Jimmy Carter was still able. The Republicans, who was talking about this? Kevin Phillips, part of one of the developers of the Republican strategy.
Yeah.
And Lee Atwater talked about this in his famous interview, where he kind of gave the game away about the Republican strategy. They were focusing on the rural outlying areas
Right.
in that election,
Right.
and kind of giving up the urban centers.
Well, this is the
to Carter.
'88. This is after Reagan retires, when he ran against Dukakis.
Mm-hmm.
He was the main guy who defeated Dukakis.
Atwater?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Yeah. He was kind of in that interview, he was kind of going, he was talking about the evolution of playing off of racial resentment in the South.
Right.
From
right.
Nixon through
Right.
Reagan
Right.
and Bush.
Well, that evolution is still evolving.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
Charleston,
absolutely.
West Virginia. Charleston,
Yeah.
South Carolina.
Oh, yeah. It's
So anyway, what were the issues that Ronald Reagan won on? He did have some issues on his television set.
Yeah, he did. The thing that stuck out to me, one of his big themes was always states' rights. I mean, he played off of that.
Well, that was Goldwater's theme.
Yeah,
But
his big thing that I remember is.
But he won nationally now.
Yeah.
He won on the
Playing-
media. He won on unemployment.
Yeah, are you better off than you were
Inflation.
4 years ago?
Yeah,
Inflation,
and he blamed that
employment.
on Carter, even though it wasn't Carter's fault. It was
Right.
the oil companies.
Yeah.
But
He played off the hostage crisis.
Yeah, and appeasement, using
Right.
the old anti-communist thing. So he had cliches, popular now. What about the Jewish
Security.
vote? There's a kind of an odd thing there.
Well, at this time, well, that's interesting. As we've talked about, there was a development of the Jewish vote during the Carter administration.
That's right.
And the Zionists, the emergence of the neoconservatives,
Right.
Podhoretz, and the rest of them,
Right.
Wolfowitz, and their concerns about Carter's, what they would have considered Carter's
Appeasement.
questionable support of
Yeah,
Israel and
appeasement,
appeasement of Israel's enemies in the Middle
the
East.
Jews did stick with Carter, but you see, it dropped. They voted 90% for Franklin Roosevelt, 80% for Hubert Humphrey. And in this Reagan-Bush election, the Jewish voted 60% for the Democrats. That's a 20% drop. And that's just enough to take
About 30 years' time, a little bit over 30 years.
Yeah, but it's just enough to take key states like Reagan. Could take New York, California, Illinois, Pennsylvania. There's just enough. You got to have a solid Jewish vote to win. That's what I'm saying. The Democrats have to have a solid Jewish vote. Well, New York and Pennsylvania and Massachusetts all drifted to Reagan. That's the statistics there. That's where these statistics show up. So Israel turns out to be the elephant in the living room. Now it's losing ground now. I think the elephant has been identified a little more. But anyway, the Jews are far better educated than the average Protestant or Roman Catholic for the size of the population. So anybody who is an anti-Semite should drop that and go to a university and become, like Jews, a PhD or a philosopher or a historian or a lawyer or a medical doctor and show that you have skills and that those skills are useful. So Carter was a little bit on the ropes. Carter was not an anti-Semite.
No.
But he misread the Old Testament and the Jewish Bible. And the modern Jew is not too interested in the Old Testament and thinks that history began in 1933 with Adolf Hitler or in 1948 with the establishment of Israel. So Carter was good on his old ancient history, but not very good on 20th century history. Okay, number 7, another question. What did Ronald Reagan say about the issues of liberty and freedom and communism?
What did Reagan say about it? Well, I mean, he played up the traditional
what
anti-communism
I'm getting at is, what is the
hysteria.
meaning of democracy? Did Ronald Reagan ever say anything about democracy? Or was it just anti-communist?
I'm not sure where you're going with this.
Well, what I'm saying is that anti-communism is not the same as a pro-democrat. And this has been a mistake of the entire American society from Truman's day to the present.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're going to have to wind up pretty soon.
Well, I agree with that, absolutely. I think that a lot of people might mistake even what democracy is supposed to mean. Democracy, very simply, means power to the people.
Right.
To govern themselves.
Right. Abraham Lincoln had the best statement for it. It's government of the people, by the people, and for the people.
Right.
But it's become plutocracy.
Oh, yeah.
Now, that wasn't decided overnight, but it's been the gradual erosion of Franklin D. Roosevelt's conception of democracy, because he spoke about democracy all the time.
Oh, yeah. Power gets concentrated more and more in the hands of the
so
few.
it's a negative. So Ronald Reagan
and the wealthy.
has been called the great communicator. I call him the great propagandist.
I agree with that.
He just built on the negatives, and they worked for him.
Yes.
Well, I have another little question here. In the November 1980 election, well, do you want to have a summary, or shall I go on to a new question?
I know where you're about to go. Do you want me to just sum up what happened in the House and the Senate real quick?
Well, maybe we can, we'll leave out the House.
Leave out the House?
Let's talk about the Senate.
The Senate is the one that actually changed hands.
All right, what is the story there?
Well, what happened was the Republicans gained a net of 12 seats from Democrats, and they gained control of the Senate, 53 to 46 with one independent.
Right.
So that means majority and minority leaders Robert Byrd of West Virginia and Howard Baker exchanged places.
Right.
It marked the first time since 1954 that the Republican Party had controlled either house of Congress.
Right.
Interestingly, though, and I think noteworthy, despite their gains in seats, Republican Senate candidates actually lost the popular vote.
Well, I forgot that statistic.
Popular vote I have at 26,597,000 for Republicans.
Well, you're totaling up all of the senators.
That's all of them, yeah.
Yeah. Well,
I just find that interesting, that they lost the popular vote.
I find that a meaningless issue because people vote for in a state.
Yeah. Well, George W. Bush lost the popular vote, too, in 2000.
Yeah. Well, rather than looking at the popular vote, some of the big Democratic losses were Alaska. One liberal lost. They lost 2 Alabama seats, conservatives. 1 Florida seat. 1 Georgia seat. That's 4 losses. Idaho, big loss there. Frank Church.
Oh, yeah. He had been a presidential contender.
Right. Well, he was the
that.
guy who investigated
the Church
Operation
Committee.
Phoenix and so forth and so on. But it was a smash for the Vietnam dubs. That's what I'm saying. Indiana, liberal lost. Iowa, John Culver lost, another dub from the Vietnam era. New Hampshire, a liberal lost. North Carolina, probably conservative. Oklahoma, probably conservative. South Dakota, who lost there?
Did McGovern lose? Yeah.
That's the end of McGovern's career. And the end of the Vietnam dubs, okay?
So
it is a new era,
yep.
Okay, for looking at the Senate. Okay, Louisiana, Texas, so forth. We have to close here. And this was a victory for Ronald Reagan personally and a defeat for the 12 Democrats who lost. But Tip O'Neill hangs on in the Senate.
he did. He maintained control over the U.S. House.
Right.
And then he went on to make way too many compromises, in my point of view.
Well, that's another story.
Yeah, we'll get to that later. Today, we've talked about the evolution of Ronald Reagan's political career and the big win in 1980.
And we have to keep this debate going between the right and the left, between Democrats and Republicans, in order to revive a democratic philosophy against plutocracy and imperialism.
That's right. I agree. Thank you,
Okay.
Professor.
Thank you.